Good morning. It's excellent to hear His Highness's remarks on the state of the geopolitical outlook for 2012 and beyond, and also his views on economics and the lack of robust belief of 2012, particularly from the Eurozone and from the United States right now. A year ago here at the GCF, we could see the crest of the wave in a near distance, if I can put it that way, which was the uprisings taking place in Tunisia in December, and a few short days followed the march onto Tahrir Square, forming a tsunami that would alter politics and economics in the region as we know today. At that point in 2012, we didn't see it clearly as a game changer. Today we're looking through the windscreen of 2012 and asking, what are the key things I need to watch out for? That's the point of our panel session this morning, the global risk of 2012. Europe is trying to set up fire breaks in place, and on the southern flank of Europe, not wanting the crisis from Greece and Portugal to spread to Italy, as they have the discussions today on restructuring Greece's debt. U.S. elections, and most importantly, U.S. debt after the elections in 2013. Does it impact the role of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency is something we can address this morning. Russia, elections in March taking place. Putin 2.0 is less than sure than it was even 45 days ago. What is Putin 2.0 going to look like? Iran, nuclear development. The report in November from the IAEA has prompted a ratcheting up of tensions, of course, here in the region, and Syria remains a hotspot with no near-term solution. What's the influence of that going forward? And finally, North Korea. Is this the beginning of the end of this isolated state? And what does that mean for unification? And very importantly, what is China's role? Also in the region, South Asia, Pakistan, what's been taking place over the last 2 months and the rapidly changing landscape there. We have a phenomenal panel this morning, 2 leading CEOs from around the world and 2 thought leaders, the former Prime Minister of Canada and the head of Chatham House, to address the geopolitical and the economic issues for 2012. We have the luxury of having an overview of what to look out for in that windscreen I was just talking about. Let's give a warm welcome to Paul Polman, the Chief Executive Officer of the largest food company in the world, Unilever. Thanks very much.
Good morning, Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests. I salute you with respect and thanks for the opportunity to be here again in Riyadh. I was here in 2010. I wanted to congratulate you on the 6th annual Competitiveness Congress Forum organized by Sagia, which seems to get better every year I get here. And I'm very pleased to take this opportunity to just make a few opening remarks to set the stage for the panel, as I was asked to do, and talk about global risk for 2012 seen from a perspective of business. And I won't be talking about the predicted Mayan apocalypse. Apparently, the end of the world is near in 2012, according to the Mayans, but I'll stay away from that. In fact, when I was here in 2010, it was just after we absorbed the effects of the financial crisis. And we talked about the different role that business had to play at that time. In fact, my remarks then are as valid today. Although I wish that more businesses would have acted earlier already, because what is very clear is that the financial crisis in 2008 turned into a full-blown economic crisis. And I think you would agree with me now that we're facing, coming out of that, a political and leadership crisis. Some people call this the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in this environment, which is going to stay with us for many years to come, we certainly need new forms of leadership in this increasingly interdependent world, and we also, I would submit, need new forms of business models. I'm off to the World Economic Forum, which I have the pleasure to co-chair this year, and the title of the World Economic Forum this year is The Great Transformation, Shaping New Models, a very timely title. Some people are questioning the very form of capitalism itself, which I certainly would not do, but it is clear that the way we have arrived at where we are today probably needs some changes and adjustments to expand the narrow or too narrow definition of economic interest. Some people called it quarterly capitalism. I would argue that it's time for the longer-term business models, the business models based, yes, on capitalism, but more on social responsible forms of capitalism that give us a more equitable and sustainable growth. And I was very pleased to see in the weekend edition of the Financial Times, Bill Clinton writing a column around that topic as well. Not addressing this issue, which is causing great dissatisfaction amongst many people in the world who feel they're left behind, is probably one of the biggest risks biggest risks we face to economic and social stability in the world. Let me just point out this morning, for the interest of time, 3 areas or underlying trends which I think will point out some of the risks that we face as business people that we need to deal with. The first one is a growing power vacuum, especially at national government levels, to respond to the global economic crisis, and increasingly governments looking inwards instead of outwards, focusing heavily and increasingly so on the questions of domestic economic stability at the expense of international security concerns. The second area of risk is filling the void by consumers and citizens. Consumers and citizens are clearly dissatisfied, but in ways that not always are coherent or solution-based, and that brings risks with it. And the third area, not surprisingly, is the growing implications of a resource-scarce or resource-constrained world, where, unfortunately, again, in the absence of concrete strategies by governments or international institutions, increasingly individual or business actions are needed to address these challenges. Let me take each of them very briefly in turn, and you know what I'll be talking about. The first one is the political vacuum. And it's not only Europe I'm talking. We're seeing clearly a shift in world power that was referred to earlier already. Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, the Lee Kuan Yew School, calls it in his book the irresistible shift of the power east. I would also say south should be with that. And whilst the powers are shifting, the economic powers I'm talking about, it's not always clear and predictable what it is going to be. At a time that the world more than ever needs clear direction and strong political leadership, we're actually seeing increasingly political vacuums. A declining United States leverage creates definitely a gap in the external political engagements, economic support, which has been incredibly important, and security provisions, at a time of increasing geopolitical volatility. And in Europe, because of the euro crisis that you're well familiar with, it is not different. Unfortunately, we're entering a year with major elections in China, in the US, Russia, France, and I don't think you will see many of the politicians stepping up to the international plate. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how institutions work, be it the G20, barely expanded from the G8 or the WTO or many other ones that are struggling with this world and their role in it. The result is a continued economic slowdown, certainly in Europe, to some extent in the US, and difficulties to come to conclusions to the benefit of a greater world. In fact, in many places, people would say there's no one in charge, and many of the decisions coming from our politicians, unfortunately, are too little, too late, especially in Europe, where I spent some of my time. The second risk that we need to face as businesses is the consumer in charge. Now, that's positive on some extent, because the consumer is increasingly filling this vacuum that you see there, driven actually by the rapid advances of social media. Technology, globalization of technology really cannot be stopped. And that trend will only accelerate, and that's a good thing. We've seen with the Arab Spring an indication of what is there to come. And it isn't just an issue for governments or political institutions. If they can bring down a government in 17 days, as happened in Egypt, which I would say is the first sign of a social internet or Facebook-based revolution, you can bring down companies like ours in nanoseconds. Consumers are clearly dissatisfied with the state of the world, dissatisfied with a growth that is increasingly not equitable and not sustainable. They're worried about not only themselves, but their future generations. And increasingly, they are discovering the power of social media to organize themselves. We see that in Earth Day, an initiative started by the World Life Fund, now having 2 billion people turning off their lights. We see it with a guy like Oscar Morales, violence against the FARC, getting 12 million people in the streets in 2 minutes. We see it when Netflix wants to increase its prices in the US and consumers go in overdrive and they have to reverse it. Consumers are discovering the tools. But unfortunately, as you've seen with Occupy Wall Street, dissatisfaction and desire for change without solution is not an option either. And increasingly, we see, as Thomas Friedman was saying recently in the International Herald Tribune, we need to marry the desire for change that our young generation has, especially in the emerging markets, where over half the people, after all, are below 30, with a little bit of vision and experience from the older generations to be sure that that energy is channeled in the right direction, and that will be a challenge. In fact, it was Nelson Mandela who said that vision without action is merely a dream, and action without vision is merely passing time. But vision with action can actually change the world, and that's obviously that we need to steer to. The third area, as you're well familiar with, is the end of the age of abundance. We're just simply consuming more than the world can replenish, and that should be something that should concern you as well. In fact, you're the third biggest or highest water consumption country in the world. No, after 2 other ones, but your average consumption of 386 liters, I think, per day is amongst the highest in the world. And yet we know that increasingly our resources are scarce. We have 1 billion people going to bed hungry every day, and that number is increasing again. 2.5 billion people no access to basic hygiene and water. And many of our resources increasingly challenged by unsustainable sourcing. So if we want to live for many generations to come, and if we want to be successful, we have to address this issue of energy, water, food nexus, very well explained by many in our business models. So these are the 3 key areas of risk. Now, I'm an optimist, and I think it's no better time for business than now. As governments shrink and don't have solutions, as consumers look for answers, people that have the ability to step up to the plate and provide constructive solutions, I think will get the benefits from this change. Companies that don't adapt, that are not in sync with society, will soon be dinosaurs, in my opinion. The first thing that leadership needs to do is bring business back to long-term focus. At Unilever, it means very simply that we've abolished guidance to the market. We don't report quarterly anymore, changed drastically our compensation systems to be sure that the framework in which we do business is based on the benefit of not only us, but also our consumers and our stakeholders for the long term and not just for the short term. We need to increasingly, in a world like this, take steps with others, feel comfortable of working with government or non-governmental institutions, with industry at large, to be sure that the working in a collaborative fashion gives us solutions to these challenges that we simply have not been able to address alone. A good example of this is the Global Consumer Goods Forum. The top manufacturing and retail companies in the world, representing about 3 trillion of sales, have come together to call for a moratorium on deforestation by the year 2020. No more pulp, paper, soy, beef from illegal deforestation, which accounts for about 16% of global warming. We need to enroll the consumer very constructively. After all, the consumer is about influencing directly or indirectly about 70% of the use of the resources, the way they cook, the way they buy and consume, the way they shower. How do we get them to understand that standards of living, that quality of life can be as good but in a more sustainable way? A good example of that is here in the Kingdom, where we have a wonderful brand, Lipton, which we're converting to sustainable tea, or the initiative with the National Water Authority Board here to help consumers cut their water usage in their homes by about 10%. It's a tremendous improvement you can do. And last but not least, we have to take co-responsibility of some of the structural issues that we are facing. You take the issue of food security, for example. If the governments are not coming with solutions, and it would be unfair, in my opinion, to ask them alone to do that, business needs to step up. For that reason, we have created a coalition with major food companies, and I've been very pleased to chair the G20 task force on food security. We will continue that in Mexico to put concrete solutions out there for the world that with 2 billion more people coming needs about 70% more food to feed them all. How can we do that in a sustainable way? So have business take more responsibility for some of these broader issues. Because after all, it is very clear, if society doesn't function properly, I don't think business has a lot of long-term success either. I'd leave it like that. In Unilever, we've translated that in what we call a Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. It sets some very clear targets to source all of our products sustainably, to give about 1 billion people access to nutrition and health, to create 500 million jobs in our supply chain, mainly with smallhold farmers, and to totally decouple growth from environmental impact. It is a very simple business model that is not based on the premise of how can I use business and the environment to be successful. That is not based on the premise of how can I use environment and society to be successful, but it's based on the premise of how can I give to society and the environment to be successful. And if more businesses take that approach, we create a critical mass, I think we can start to influence some of these risks we are taking. Thanks for your attention.
Paul Polman, thanks very much for setting the framework for the debate. Let me introduce in our Global Risk 2012 CNN debate, Jean Chrétien, the 20th Prime Minister of Canada, Dennis Nally, the Chief Executive of PricewaterhouseCoopers, Robin Niblett, the Director of Chatham House, and we've already have Paul Polman, of course, the Chief Executive Officer of Unilever. Just to set the framework for what's going to take place, this is the annual 2012 CNN debate, which means you'll see it broadcast Tuesday evening at 1900, 7 p.m. In local time here in Saudi Arabia. We're going to have a very open debate floor discussion for about 40 minutes, and if time certainly permits, we'd love to take questions from the floor. I just ask that you keep the questions very direct because we're going to be part of the debate and we want to be able to ask direct questions and get direct answers from our roundtable. I kind of see this structure as one where we can split it up between the demands of business today in 2012 and the outlook for business and the geopolitical concerns that I talked about in my opening remarks. I'd like to, if I may here, we have the luxury of having Dennis Nally, the Chief Executive Officer of PricewaterhouseCoopers. He, like me, does the sand to snow along with Mr. Polman and Mr. Niblett. We'll be going from here to Davos, and PwC tomorrow will be releasing a CEO global survey, taking the pulse of chief executive officers from the United States, from Europe, from here in the Middle East, and from Asia, and what the outlook is for 2012. Dennis, after hearing from Paul and hearing from His Highness Prince Turki earlier about some of the geopolitical concerns that are there, how would you pinpoint, if you can, to get it started, the feeling on the ground? You said you took 1,200 CEOs and the pulse of what they're thinking today. What is the outlook as they see it now in the context of the geopolitical and business risks that exist?
Sure. Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be back here at the Forum this year. Maybe just to set the context for you, a year ago when we were here and we were talking about the confidence levels that exist coming from the business community, I would characterize it as being fairly positive, very optimistic. I think many felt that when business looked out over the next 12 to 18 months, most would have concluded that the worst is behind, that the global economic recovery was on track. Said another way, there was a light at the end of the tunnel after a very difficult, challenging last 3 years, if you will. And so things were looking fairly positive when we were together a year ago. When I step back, and we're in the process of finalizing our 15th annual CEO survey as we speak, when I step back and look at the level of confidence coming from the business community, and this is from around the world, confidence levels have really dropped in a very significant way year to year. And I think it goes to many of the issues that we're here to talk about over the next day or so, which is all of the volatility that's out there, whether it's the geopolitical issues that Paul and others have referenced here, whether it's other concerns out there in terms of the sovereign debt crisis in Europe and what that really means. All of these, what I would describe as clouds, are there, which are creating a high degree of uncertainty, a high degree of questions in terms of where the global economic picture really sits today. And that is an outlook over the next 12 to 18 months. What's really interesting, though, at least when we look at some of the findings from the CEO survey, is that when you ask CEOs to talk about the level of optimism they have with respect to their own company's growth prospects, it's actually very encouraging. It's actually fairly positive. Not as confident as they were a year ago, but they are basically disaggregating their views around the outlook for the global economy, which is fairly negative, but almost the exact opposite in terms of having a positive view in terms of their own opportunities within their company to grow. And what we would translate that to mean is that with all of this volatility that's out there, with all this uncertainty that's out there, CEOs and business are getting much more comfortable in dealing with all of those kinds of issues and trying to make sure that that does not impede their ability to seize the opportunity that are there. So it's a very different picture today versus a year ago, but one in which I think gives you some sense that the business community, notwithstanding all the issues that are there, are basically dealing with the issues that are out there.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Paul, I want to put one of the biggest risks on the table today, and that's the European debt crisis. The terminology of kicking the can down the road for the better part of a year when it comes to Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and now having this firebreak going into Italy. How do you see the European Commission, the European Central Bank, dealing with the crisis today? Can they establish a firebreak where that doesn't spill into Italy in a greater fashion than we have today?
Yeah, I think ultimately, although the speed of decision-making in this regard is terribly slow, I think the way that the Greek crisis was handled and still is being handled is causing a lack of confidence in the political system. And what you see spilled over to the other countries probably is more the effect of a lack of confidence than anything else. I personally am fairly optimistic, bar perhaps one country that might leave the euro, that we will find solutions to keep the system going. But when people talk about the European debt crisis, I don't really think it's a European debt crisis. It really is a crisis of Europe's increasing lack of competitiveness. Ultimately, we have lived well beyond our means. We have spent more than we earned. We've spent it on the wrong things that haven't given us the productivity and the competitiveness, and the rest of the world is rapidly catching up. Europe has declined its investments in R&D, education. The European market actually is incredibly complex and increases the cost for business to be there. So we have to address Europe's competitiveness. At the same time, we have to recognize that world economic powers are changing and going back to what they were 300-400 years ago in the first place. So for Europe to expect the same role in the future or the same economic prosperity would be naive. And unfortunately, if people don't face to the facts, I'm afraid that the decisions that are being taken are not the right ones. And that is what we need to work on with the policymakers in Europe.
Before I move to our geopolitical strategists here, Mr. Niblet and obviously the Prime Minister, Mr. Chrétien, I'd like to get one more business response here to what you count on from both Dennis and Paul. Are you banking on then recession in Europe of 1 to 1.5% in 2012? And then I'd love to get your thoughts on the level of the U.S. debt burden and what that's going to mean post-2012 elections. Dennis, do you want to start?
Well, you know, I think when you really step back and you look at what I would say is what it appeared to be a consensus about global growth for fiscal year 12 you're talking about 2 to 2.5% of real GDP growth across all of the world. And obviously, there's significant pluses and minuses when you start to look at, various parts of the world. We certainly look at Europe today, whether they're in a recession or not. They're very close to that stage. And the reality is, I agree 100% with what Paul just said. This really goes to the competitiveness of that part of the world vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and the significant economic rebalancing that's really taking place. So that's the reality. I think the rebalancing that we've talked about, whether you go from the west to the east or from the developed markets to the developing markets, that is real. That's here to stay. That needs to be a key factor in terms of how business thinks about where the opportunities are, how they make their investments, and how they grow their businesses. And that's certainly what we see with every one of our clients as they think about what the long-term potential is and where the future lies.
Good. Yeah, with the amount of deleveraging that needs to happen in Europe, you'd be naive to plan your business on anything else but a 10-year period of stagnation, more in line with what we've seen in Japan. That is the realistic scenario you need to plan on. If it turns out to be better, good for all of us, but very unlikely. I think we're going to see, because the demographics in Europe are also against you. It's a declining and aging population with an increasing debt burden just to serve the debt. And the cost to maintain the system that we've chosen is actually increasing as well. So I believe that Europe has to plan on a 10-year Japan situation. As far as the euro debt is concerned, which you're right as well, but it's so interdependent with some of the other major powers in the world that I think the US is able to still borrow and finance that at very low interest rates. But ultimately, the only way to address that debt is through deflation of their currency. I don't think the US will ever be able to balance it in any other way. And that is obviously what the focus is in terms of where the RMB should be and where the dollar should be.
So you're suggesting over time that the US dollar may not be the reserve currency. Are we looking at a 10 to 20-year horizon that a Unilever plans for?
It is highly likely that other alternatives in that time frame will be available.
Okay. Robin, it would be good to get your thoughts on the very contentious and hot issues in the region right now. We were sitting on this stage a year ago, and we saw what unfolded in Tunisia. It spread like wildfire throughout the region. But the biggest concern most have today is about Iran and this inevitability of perhaps conflict taking place there. How do you see it unfolding?
Clearly, the way in which the Arab uprisings have played out, I think has ended up creating some real risks for Iran in Iran's own perception of its position in the region. In a way, Iran was a very comfortable state, at least in my impression, when it could look out at other leaderships in the region and say that many of them were backing the United States, backing the West. It stood up in a way for an Arab, despite being a Persian country, almost an Arab nationalism that had taken away from Egypt, from other countries that really had not been in a position to take a leadership role internationally, perhaps even competing a bit with Turkey for this role. But now I think Iran is on the back foot regionally, and there's no better example of this than what is taking place in Syria. And I think it is looking to rebalance that loss of leverage that it's had in the region. It's coming under pressure from the West, obviously, after the IEA report that came out in November. A much more aggressive position being taken now by Israel. It's trying to compensate a little bit in Iraq, trying to show, well, if we lose influence in Syria, maybe we can apply it in Iraq. Obviously, there's escalating tensions in the Gulf region as well. I suppose I'm concerned this is not just about the nuclear issue. I think this is a much larger repositioning of Iran, trying to sense, is it going to be a loser from the changes that took place in 2011? And it's trying to adjust its position, refine its positions of leverage for a country that's pretty lonely in the world stage, not exactly a country that can line up its allies behind it very quickly. Even Turkey, seems to have linked itself a bit with the United States, certainly in context of some missile defense units that are being applied there from the US. So my concern would be that Iran is going to find itself increasingly feeling surrounded and can be unpredictable in this kind of environment. And that unpredictability adds to the kind of uncertainty that we have in the global economic level. I don't see, direct conflict emerging in the Straits of Hormuz kind of issue in this year. I think the Iranians would be crazy to let that happen. Certainly if the EU comes up with some type of embargo, the Iranians are going to have to get their oil out somewhere else. So in any case, it's a complicated situation, but I think this is really spinning out of 2011 as much as being something from 2012.
Prime Minister Chrétien, you've been in government service for more than 40 years and have a perspective on the effectiveness of sanctions and the pursuit of policy by the United States, the European Union right now, Saudi Arabia in the region and others in the region that want to apply the pressure to Iran. Is this the correct strategy, sir?
But it's the only strategy, but I'm not sure that it will be, produce results very rapidly. I saw this week, for example, Greece is having some doubt about participating because they get some direct benefit from Iran. And as somebody mentioned, our colleague mentioned earlier, the question of the nuclear disarmament is an issue that will not be resolved. Nobody knows exactly when they will be producing a bomb, if ever they do. And, and it's very complicated because this problem is not only a question of, it's a question of prestige for them. It's why they will not back down very easily when they see that Pakistan has a bomb and the rumors that Israel has a bomb and all that, make them, why not have one for us? The world say we don't want them to have it, but they will probably play the game that they want it for, they say they don't want it, working to have it. Politically, that gave them something to score politically locally, I guess. And I'm not sure that they will drop that very rapidly.
Good. Let me follow up with you quickly here so we're clear on what your position is. Is this a game of recognition by Iran? And there should be dialogue behind the scenes to get them to the bargaining table here and bring them into the fold as opposed to isolating Iran?
It's clear that, they want to be more influential in the area. And all the development around, as mentioned by the previous speaker, might change a lot their position. They are more isolated in a way than they were. They don't know exactly what will happen. Probably the biggest political problem that we face at this moment is the evolution of what will happen in all these countries. Like Egypt and Libya and so on, that will have a lot of influence. What will happen in Syria? Will the president from Syria to quit soon and so on? So that put Iran in a position of complete uncertainty, and that could force them eventually to flip to a new position that will surprise all of us. I really don't know. It's very complex at this time, and because the Arab Spring is not producing rapidly the result that we were hoping for. It's very complex what's going on in Egypt at this time. What will happen in Libya now? Will it remain only one country, become two countries? And, it's all that what must be putting the Iranian in a position that they don't know at all what will happen. And don't forget that the election of America will have a lot of influence too. Because when you listen to the debate these days by the Republican candidates, some are a bit surprising in their position. And, but the speech will last, and they will be trapped in probably changing the position. My view is the foreign affairs policies of President Obama have been, in my book, quite successful. He has promised to be out of Iraq. He is. He's moving out of Afghanistan. It's amazing. The Republican in the debate that, because with the neighbor we're watching every night when we don't have a good hockey game, we turn and watch politics, and that, it's, they don't talk foreign policies at all, very much. And some of the statements were made were very surprising by Perry and others, you know.
Well, in fact, let me follow up on that because I think it's a big global risk for 2012. We had Governor Rick Perry of Texas before he bowed out suggesting that Turkey should leave NATO.
Yeah.
Newt Gingrich, after his victory in South Carolina, suggested that we don't need to bow down to the King of Saudi Arabia anymore. We should be independent on energy policy going forward. That seems like a global risk for a geopolitical balance,
Yeah,
from
but
what I can hear.
But it's funny they don't want to buy oil from Canada.
They do buy a lot of oil from Canada, as a matter of fact.
So now, you know, it's a very unusual situation because if the tar sands are producing pollution, they're not producing pollution in the United States. It's producing pollution in Canada. And I think that we have a lot of oil reserve. It will be much safer to take that from us. But I think at the end they will accept the pipeline. But it's just the politics of today.
I can have you address the issues about the foreign policy positions we're hearing from the Republicans in the primaries. And then Robin and Dennis, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Is there a risk inherent here in the direction the Republican Party is coming in? And if there was a victory, do we take these proclamations about pushing Turkey out of NATO or the position on Saudi Arabia seriously or not?
You know, the very surprising thing that I observe is the statement made by Ron Paul on to bring everything back to America. We don't want anymore to be the policeman of the world and so on. He attracted the young people of the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, this man was the oldest candidate. He has very unusual policies, but on foreign affairs, he was calling for America not to come around the world and tell everybody what to do, and we need our soldiers here. We're spending money for nothing. And it was not the people of his age who were applauding. It was all the kids from university. And that, so that will have an influence. He will not be the candidate. I hope. It's not my business, but he will have these ideas seems to be very popular.
Good. Dennis, get your perspective and then go to Robin.
Well, I tell you, I certainly would prefer a good hockey game to watching those Republican debates. But having said that, I think many of the comments that have been made thus far on the panel are directly influencing how the business community is looking at the next 12 to 18 months. I mean, no matter where you go, what part of the world, there are significant issues that are out there that are affecting the level of confidence that the business community has in terms of the outlook for the next 12 to 18 months. And there's various issues that are driving that, whether they are the political issues that we've touched on, whether there are certainly economic issues coming out of Europe, the deficit issues in the United States, the inability to get things done out of Washington, the types of things that we're all familiar with, the issues in Korea and what that really means. All of these factors are influencing how business is looking at the outlook for the next 12 to 18 months. But the thing that continues to be amazing to me anyways is the way that the business world is looking at all of these uncertainties. They're basically saying, we can't control these, we can't manage these, we have to learn to deal with these. And what we're trying to focus on is creating organizations that, in my words, are much more resilient to really deal with the potentiality of many of these kinds of issues affecting the business model that's out there. And that's a change in thinking, at least the way we look at it, in the last 3 to 4 years. The issues are real. You can't really predict what is going to happen here, but you have to create an organization that is able to respond and to really act quickly, and that's a major change in thinking in terms of how to manage these types of risks today versus maybe 3 to 5 years ago.
Robin, it's an interesting phrase in the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2012 discussing almost acute globalization, that things are moving so fast that people want to cocoon. They want to remain in their own patch, as Prime Minister Chrétien was suggesting here. What influence is this going to have on global risk going forward? The rising powers of Russia and China around the Security Council table, and splitting the positions of the United States and Europe, for example?
Well, I think acute globalization is where the comments made initially on this panel are meeting the geopolitical comments, because part of what's been remarkable, I think, so far is that at least in Asia and in East Asia, where some of the most profound geopolitical changes are taking place, the rise of China, US leadership being somewhat contested, Japan having been a weak country in its region now for a long time, that in that part of the world at the moment, the forms of informal coordination and self-interest are still keeping this in a relatively benign area. If you take the contrast of Europe back in the 20th century, where changes of power really led to appalling wars, at the moment, so far, in Asia and East Asia, there's a balance between rising Chinese power and a desire to still keep the United States engaged. And I think the US actually has been playing its hand quite well across the whole Asia region so far, being conscious of demands that it still remain involved, and in a way yet but not rubbing China's nose in it, that it is still involved. And I'm relatively positive and encouraged by that side of it. What worries me more is this interconnectivity of the global economy and what is taking place in that part of the world. We talked a minute about US leadership. There was a time when you could expect the US to get you out of problems. But at the moment, Europe's very weakness could become a weakness for many countries around the world that could then spill politically. You know, you forget that Europe is China's main export market. It's not the US, it's the EU. And at the same time, although EU-US trade is pretty high, $500 billion, something like that, the kind of returns that US companies make from their subsidiaries based in Europe that have been there for many decades is a huge part of their profitability and return. If Europe slows down, the geopolitical implications as global growth may slow in other parts of the world are serious. And let's not forget, China has gone through some remarkable rise in public protests and political protests this last year. You know, we did not see 2011 coming in 2010. But I think the Chinese leadership are looking at this slowdown that's taking place almost too fast for them to be able to adjust their own economy. And I have to be really quite concerned at a time of leadership changes there, that these public protests don't get out of hand, and that this interconnection of technology, young people's frustration, and a severe economic rebalancing don't rebound into China quicker than we can manage it. And that would be one of my big, I suppose, acute globalization concerns.
Okay, there's the issue of Russia, which I wanted to bring up, the spiraling situation in Pakistan, which is unfolding very rapidly, not recognized on a day-to-day basis because of some of the other things that Robin has brought up. I think I'll ask it in this context, though, if I may. If you're going to pick out the biggest global risk for 2012, from a geopolitical standpoint or a business standpoint, what would you identify right now? Paul?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, I think Pakistan certainly is an area that is increasingly in turmoil and unpredictable what course it takes, and that should concern us, not the least for the Pakistani people, many who have nothing to do with this. So I always feel more concerned for our consumers than anything else. But the biggest risk is what you were saying before. It is clear that the US is going back increasingly to its home turf and abdicating its global role it has played as moral policeman. And I think the Arab Spring you were referring to has not helped America in this region. And unfortunately, the Chinas and the Indias are not willing to step up to the plate. And it's the same with companies like ours. If you have a certain size, you have to, with that comes responsibility. I always like to quote Viktor Frankl, who said when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast of the United States. So if we want the world to function, then and 85% of the world population is going to be in the emerging countries, India and China, obviously the biggest part of that, then there comes a time that they have to step up to the plate and take responsibility to be part of these solutions. And I think the bigger challenge will be, when will we get them there? Because if not, you see the same on the negotiations on climate change or other things. It's very difficult for the world to see solutions to some of these challenges that are increasingly becoming pertinent.
Great. Robin?
I suppose there are two things that have kind of real geopolitical risks. One, again, is this something we didn't expect last year when the tsunami took place, Fukushima. There is a level of interconnectivity now of the global economy where a major natural disaster or a man-made disaster can really spill over borders. I don't know what that one could be this year, but I think the resilience issue that Dan Snell just mentioned is extremely important in this area. Cybersecurity is an area in which we are becoming increasingly, again, dependent for our interconnected businesses, political and communications world, and yet at the same time the vulnerability of this is being increasingly exposed and being used now as a form of weapon. And we're finding this in the Middle East in particular, Israel, Iran. This could spill over into other parts of the world in a way that we don't quite understand the ramifications of. So I think a cybersecurity, still perhaps a terrorist attack, could have really large implications on a just-in-time global economy that spills over. My one wild card, which has always been my wild card, is North Korea. I think this was mentioned a minute ago, where that leadership change is very unpredictable. It's a country that I don't think necessarily leads itself on rational expectations, but has an extreme siege mentality. And that just worries me. That kind of transition taking place could be quite destabilizing at some point during the year.
Okay. Dennis, you want to share your thoughts? Is it picking up off the survey, or do you want to look further afield?
You know, I think the one issue that has come through loud and clear post-financial crisis is what Robin was referring to, which is how interconnected this global economy really is. And I think when we went into this financial crisis, there was many that had some belief that you would basically see the developed markets decouple from the emerging markets. And I think the exact opposite has been demonstrated coming out of the financial crisis. And whether it's the tsunami and the implications of what happened in Japan to many companies and their supply chains, whether it's the sovereign debt issues that we've been talking about in terms of Europe, the lack of leadership maybe coming out of Washington in terms of the United States really leading some of the debate and discussions to finalization here. How we're all intertwined and connected here, I think, is becoming more and more obvious. And I would say the number one issue that's out there in terms of what could decouple or destabilize the economic recovery that we're dealing with here is the issues that are in Europe today, and the longer those issues go unaddressed, and the more uncertainty that continues to create, I think it puts more and more pressure for the recovery to stay on an even keel and even track.
Okay. Prime Minister Chrétien, you have the final word here. Final word to you, sir.
Oh, I've been around for a few years. I was elected in '63. And at the beginning of every year, you know, we had this discussion, and I tended to be not optimistic. You know, we see in general a situation in reasonably negative. At the end of the year, most of the time, it's been better. And we have managed to progress all the time. Despite of all the ups and downs, you know, the world has progressed a lot. Today, you know, the fact that China, India, Brazil are getting bigger and bigger. In fact, and even Africa is getting more positive. You know, growth is being created around the world more than ever. You know, for years, I checked, you know, the weather, the economic weather, in looking at the last pages of The Economist. How many countries are in recession? And there are not many countries in recession today. And, you know, of course, China might not have 10% growth, but we all are desperate if they are only 8. But 8 is much better than 0. And that, you know, they are creating wealth around the world, and there is more business around the world. Of course, it used to be that most of it will be benefiting America and Europe. Now it's not the case anymore. You know, these people are using it, and it's good for us. You know, they sell more Bentley cars in China than anywhere else in the world. And I remember I met the guys who took, you know, the franchise for the Bentleys in China. When he told me that, I thought he was nuts. And now, you know, he's made a lot of money with it. Cars that we don't sell in Canada anymore, we cannot afford them. So, you know, just to show that, you know, we should not be too negative. You know, we have managed over years to overcome these difficulties. Political element of it, it's always very troubling. You know, we were all very enthusiastic a few years ago about the Arab Spring. Now we don't know what that means, and we'll have to try to assess what will be the result of it. You know, will it be a much better situation in Egypt than it was under Mubarak? I don't know. It might be not better. What will happen to Libya? I really don't know. You know, it's complicated. If Assad leaves Syria tomorrow, what will be next? You know, we tend to see these movements only positive, but probably one of the discussions that impressed me most is when I was a young, brash minister from the Canadian government I was with the Shah of Iran, and I told him how bad he was. And he told me, young man, after me it will be worse. It seemed that he was a bit right. And that, so all these experiences, at the end of the day, I think that the world tend to improve because of the technology, productivity, and so on. You know, we're in better situation today than we were 30 years ago. No doubt about it. The world has more wealth to share, and there's more people who want to share it, but I see progress. I don't think we'll go into a very, very bad depression.
Good. So it's nice to have your perspective. Thanks very much for that. We have about 5 minutes for 2 or 3 very quick questions. So if we have any questions for our panel, we have a microphone here, and we'll have one there, and one for the women's section. I thought I saw a hand go up there. If we can get one microphone there, please, and then one at this table here. And so we can have the microphones ready. You can stand up and identify yourself and just direct it at one person, please.
Good morning. Hisham Al-Dabbagh, business owner. My question to Bowman. Bowman, you mentioned that you expect the US dollar will not be the reserve currency in 10 to 15 years. And this month marks the 10th anniversary of the birth of euro. As you know, that the euro now is facing a global risk, and you discussed that actually. So we would like to know from a global leader point of view, how do you envision the future of euro in both short and mid-terms? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Pullman, that was to you.
We were talking a little bit longer than 10 to 15 years, but it is clear that if 85% of the world population lives outside of Europe and the US, and other parts of the world increase in economic prosperity, which is good, and I agree with the Prime Minister, then you also will see a rebalancing on the dependency on currencies. And I think over a little bit of longer time period that will happen. For our company, the biggest challenge is we get about 55% of our turnover from the emerging markets, and the Kingdom being one of them and doing very well. And as the Prime Minister says, it grows very quickly. In about 10 years' time, we will have 75% of our turnover in the emerging markets. So we see the world as fairly positive and increase. And indeed, with the uncertainty that the consumer is currently facing, she will be looking for certainty with companies like ours, consumer goods companies who provide brands and stay close to the consumer, is a wonderful opportunity. So I look at this as a wonderful time for our company, and not surprisingly, we're growing very fast. Our share price is an all-time high. I don't see any reason to worry other than being very close to the reality of the situation so that our business plans reflect what is happening out there. As Dennis was saying before, for business people more so than ever, they need to be in sync with what is happening in society, need to take responsibility or co-responsibility of that and build it into their business plans. If you do that, you'll have a good future. What it means for a company like ours is we really have to think about 10 years from now, what is the type of culture to be successful in our company? It's a global company, and if you run it from one location in one of the developed markets, be it the center of Europe or be it the US, and your culture is still very Euro or US centric, I don't think you're going to be successful. We've opened a major training center in Singapore now, which will be our training center for the Far East, where we have to do most of our recruiting. and that will help us. We have more people now located in Singapore than in our London headquarters. So you have to shift the footprint of your company as well if you want to be long-term successful.
Good. Did you say 55% from emerging
Right
markets?
now, 55% of our turnover is in the emerging. I don't call them emerging markets, by the way. I call them aspiring markets. So
Aspiring markets.
Aspiring markets,
Okay,
yeah.
good. We had a question, I think, from position 4. Please, if you can identify yourself.
Dr. Susanna Qurashi, King Abdulaziz University. What's the main economic challenges for Saudi Arabia in the next decades
Very good question.
in context of the current unrest in our region?
Who did you want to answer that question? Sorry.
Anyone can.
Okay. Robin,
You
I
know-
think it would be good, Prime Minister Chrétien, just very quickly, the challenges for Saudi Arabia in the decades ahead.
I think that they have to work on a regional economic expansion.
Sorry, they just can't hear you.
I think that the problem is to develop the rest of the country. You know, what amazed me is when I look at statistics, the level of wealth is big here, but it is not well redistributed. And there's big part of Saudi Arabia that don't benefit at all. And one of the biggest challenges you face here is to make sure that there is economic activities in all the parts of your kingdom. Otherwise, you will have a lot of problems. You have to redistribute the wealth. But you will, having a lot of oil, you will do very well, you know. We are in the same position than you are in Canada, and I'm a very optimistic Canadian.
Good. Robin?
I could think of 2 or 3 issues. I think how you use energy, of course, which is such a vital export for the country, but it is worrying when you see the level of a price per barrel of oil that's needed now in order to be able to feed the budget of Saudi Arabia. It's been going up, $25, $50, now close to $75 a barrel to be able to keep all of the various public spending requirements that Saudi needs. There has to be some shift in Saudi's own use of energy going forward, and this could fit within a much broader climate internationally of trying to be more resource intelligent in its usage of energy. In other words, it's a problem facing Saudi Arabia as much as any other country. And education, I think making sure that you have the right type of education for the job opportunities that are going to be needed in this very competitive world that Paul Polman was describing. Saudi Arabia will want to compete on human talent beyond just the energy sector going forward. And therefore, being able to find that right balance, I think, will be especially important. Those are 2 challenges that come to my mind.
Excellent analysis. Final question, very quickly, please.
Tommy Weir from the Emerging Market Leadership Center. Mr. Pullman, this is to you. Did we hear you correctly that you said that Unilever will be creating 500 million jobs in your supply chain? And if so, over what time period and where?
Yeah, it's a 10-year time period, and it's mainly in our supply chain. We are taking a responsibility of the total value chain. For example, on climate change, which is one of the challenges we face, it's very easy for companies, and many will focus on that, to reduce their dependency on the factories or doing less traveling and writing it in your annual report. The reality is, you just look at the carbon emission. Our own carbon emission is 3 million tons. Our total value chain is 400 million tons, going from the land, the way that the materials are sourced, to the consumer using it in the home. So taking responsibility in the one hand, sustainable sourcing, and on the other hand, sustainable living, you can have a much bigger impact. The same is true for social equality in society. 1 billion people going to bed hungry, numbers going up. 80% of the people, 75% of the people are involved in agriculture. Investments in agriculture are actually having the highest multiplier effect. You create livelihoods for people, but you also take care of the food security issues. So investing in smallhold farming is a big part of food security. We are looking at our total supply chain. Because of our tea and some other things, we have about over 100,000 smallhold farmers that work for us already, and we want to simply increase that to about 500,000. We've rolled out, and we will further expand that this week in the World Economic Forum in Davos, the new vision for agriculture, to get more companies involved. And what we obviously can do is create the market, which is very important. With the new vision for agriculture, you really focus on many of the other things, infrastructures that need to be put in place, other companies, from seed companies to collecting companies to training and developing tools for the smallhold farmers. women, involving women in agriculture, a very important part of that. 50% of smallhold farmers are women. You can increase the total output of food by 30% by just giving women land rights, access to training and tools. So one of the things that we are driving actively, and I'm very pleased about, with the G20 in Cannes, which got hijacked by the Greek crisis, that if you look at the declaration, at least food security and some of the actions that the G20 have agreed on food security have been taken on board. And we will continue that with Calderon in Mexico in June. Interestingly and sadly enough, the investments in agriculture have gone down over the last 10, 15 years. And that's a sad thing for a world that needs 70% more food as 2 billion more people come in and we change our quality of life. So we say as a company, make it very short, we take responsibility of that, be part of that. Obviously, we need the sourcing and provide the employment for people. Communities then function, markets function, and our business then has a brighter and longer-term future as well. So call it enlightened self-interest, but I think that's the new form of capitalism that we need to make the world function a little better.
Good. Thanks very much. I want to thank the audience for the input from the floor. I wish we had a bit more time for questions. We had a little bit of a later start, so we had to cut this Q&A session down a little bit. I'd like to give our special thanks to Prince Turki Al Faisal, His Highness's opening remarks for him to set the context, and to Mr. Pullman, and a nice round of applause for our panelists for being so direct for the CNN debate.